Well, that was a debate, a cordial, pretty well mannered debate. Okay, so here's my thoughts about everything. Um, I watched in three parts, so like if there's like something I skipped or missed out on the debates, wasn't so much focused on this debate as I was the Harris versus Trump debate. The vice presidential debate was last night, and it didn't exactly go the exact way I thought it would. Granted, some ways in looking back on it, like why weren't certain things addressed? I'm just like, okay, I guess in hindsight they probably weren't addressed for a good reason. But anyway, I'll get into a little bit of that in a second. What you had was two gentlemen, and gentleman is probably the word of the evening, that seemed in agreement with one another more times than not, seemed less competitive with one another more times than not, and it's just such a stark contrast compared to what you saw with Harris versus Trump. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good or bad thing as far as Harris's chances of getting elected. Um, Going into this, of all the principal characters involved of the four, between J.D. Vance, Tim Walz, Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump, I saw J.D. Vance as the absolute worst of the four, like the scariest of the four for me personally. And watching that tonight and looking at it with an objective viewpoint and eye, he probably came off as the better of the two. He sounded much more controlling, concerning in his speech. You can, say like this or that was a lie, but if stuff's not challenged, the average person is going to accept it as a truth. And he just came off as a person that was just non abrasive and just it seemed like a nice guy. And I'm like, man. And that's the thing that bugs me, is that this is the one takeaway that a lot of the undecided voters are going to have and say, like, oh, I heard some bad things about this guy, but he seemed pretty decent last night. I don't know. He seemed all right. And you can say, but no, Archfiend, people know about this and that. Like, no, 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 no. The average person doesn't care to go into the nuanced stuff. They don't care to go in on why people that take politics maybe sometimes a little too seriously, what they see in the actions in the past and in the whatevers, they're not going to look into that. They're going to look into the main bullet point times that this person has spoke. They're going to see him, what he said at the Republican National Convention, which, he didn't say anything too abrasive or anything that you would say like, oh, this guy's a lunatic. And you didn't see that last night. And as for stuff that like wasn't brought up, and one of the things obviously that if you know me for more than a video or two, you know how much the war in Ukraine is a deciding factor in my vote this year. Like, I am solely voting for the Harris ticket just because of the war in Ukraine, and mainly because JD Vance is such a staunch opponent of any sort of involvement or help and aid towards Ukraine right now. He's the one that's been filibustering in front of Congress before votes are taken as to whether or not to give additional aid to Ukraine and stuff like that. But again, the average person that is going to be that undecided voter, they're not going to know. They're not going to care to find out about stuff like that. They don't look into things. And I get it, because a lot of people just don't have time for that SHIT. Sorry, the kids are in the room. And I understand that. I understand that. Politics and just the concerning of news and the outer world beyond their specific city, state, or country is just out of sight, out of mind to, I would dare say, a majority of people in this nation. I get that. I accept that. I know that. But man, could they have asked one question about the war in Ukraine last night? But then looking into things and like sitting back and watching the whole thing, and I go like, God, they just wanted to keep things to a domestic level. I mean, other than that initial question about Iran firing ballistic missiles into Israel, and them asking the two candidates, would you vote for authorization for retaliation from Israel and stuff like that? Other than that, that was like, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the one question they asked that was about a foreign decision. I mean, sure, stuff like China and trade and foreign trade and stuff like that got brought up like in generalized statements, but I don't recall one other question than that spoke about something. And again, I I understand that because it's the undecideds that need to be talked to, and I guess CBS saw it as, let's make this a debate that talks to stuff that more appeals to the general consensus of people that are trying to make up their minds right now, and that is domestic issues. That's people coming in across the border, energy, stuff like that, stuff that people can relate to, inflation, and prices of gas and groceries, etc. So, in hindsight, looking at that, I'm like, yeah, I guess I do understand why the war in Ukraine, why the name Vladimir Putin wasn't even brought up one single time last night, not once. So, it's tough for someone like me to watch this and say, like, man, it just made JD Vance look like a really, 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 really good guy. And hey, personally, he's probably a swell guy. He's probably a guy that would help you out in a pinch if you're a friend of his or a family member, etc. But man, he has said some very, very radical things. And I have a feeling that Tim Walz didn't want to push the issue on things because he didn't want to come across as the Trump aggressor in this. He didn't want to be seen as like when it said like, oh boy, they have Trump on that side, but they also have a Trump on this side. He was constantly aggressing. And like, even if like, I just said, like, hypothetically, what if Tim Walz somehow crowbarred in the Ukraine war? Like said, just to somehow correlate it into something they were talking about last night. I could see JD Vance saying like, listen, Ukraine war is a definite serious subject that we need to talk about. But there are definite serious subjects we need to talk about in this country, like inflation, like people coming across the border, like all this. Like it would have just been swayed right back to domestic policy, domestic decisions. So I could see why Tim Walz didn't want to push the issue on that. And another thing is Tim Walz looked the weakest in the beginning of that debate, especially when asked about the questions between Israel and Iran and Hezbollah. Because he's the whole night trying to correlate everything back to Minnesota. Bless his little Midwestern heart. And I'm sure he's a tremendous governor and he's the Midwest nice and all that good stuff. But man, when you're talking about something like foreign policy, it's hard to tie it back to Minnesota nice. And that's what he was trying to do all night. And Midwest nice, Minnesota, same difference. And that's one thing. It's like JD Vance sounded more like the professional, worldly individual in the debate last night as well. So I could see the average undecided voter looking at this saying like, well, from a worldly policy standpoint, that guy kind of sounds like he's got things a little bit more in line than the guy that's all about Minnesota, 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 and Minnesota. But hey, Mr. California Ronald Reagan, he became the big world renowned guy. I mean, he's Mr. End Communism, right? You know, that was a governor. Just as Tim Walz was a governor. And I don't know. It's just, on one hand, I'm just so glad we got to see two adults in the room talk about things civilly and agree. And I'm just like, man, if it wasn't for this war in Ukraine, and again, that's not like saying that the Trump and Vance ticket is that much better, but it's just that like these two candidates between Harris and Trump are just not that good. that someone like me could easily be swayed if something like Ukraine wasn't in the mix, and if someone like Trump and Vance didn't have such a hardline stance against the war in Ukraine, I'd potentially be more willing to vote for them as a resident of Pennsylvania. We just launched into outer space over there. It's crazy. Oh boy, Pennsylvania is going to decide this election, people. And if there's just an ounce of criticism of Vladimir Putin on the Republican side of the ticket this time, someone like myself would be more willing, but I can't. Under no good sound principle in my mind. And again, I know it's more personal to me as a descendant of Russian ancestry and all that. I'm not going to bore you with my whole family story again here, but those who've been here know how personal this war is to me. Anyway, I don't know. I think both guys looked fine last night. Neither guy. And again, it's probably going to be something like, if you're going to pick a winner or loser, you're going to pick the side that more leans to your side of rhetoric or stance or what have you. I don't think either guy got summarily buried compared to the other. But if I honestly had to give a tiebreaker, I would say the stronger of the two that presented themselves better was J.D. Vance. Not by much, but yeah. It's just the beginning of the debate the beginning of the date and beginning of the date. Oh God, the beginning of the end of the debate ended strong with both candidates, but man, there was like a good half hour in the beginning where there was just a lot of verbal crutching from Tim Walz. And I'm just like, ooh, no, this guy doesn't sound like he's ready for prime time yet. But he really heated up near the end, and especially asking JD flat out, did Trump win the election? And JD Vance not answering it, and him saying, this is a darning non-answer. It's true. But anyway, again, you have to argue semantics over this point and pick on the nuanced stuff to decide who you thought won that debate last night. But I thought it was a good debate. I thought actual progress was made in the discussion of, I don't know if you want to say bipartisanship, working together, et cetera, et cetera. But man, it's a shame. I would tell you, like, I don't trust J.D. Vance, but the average person that saw that debate last night, I could see them saying, I trust that guy. He's a good salesman. Oh no, the police are coming. Look out. Okay, on that very abrupt noise note from the first responders being dispatched, I'll wrap this up. What do you think about the debate last night? If you're an independent voter, did that debate sway you more to one side or the other? Again, I'm an independent voter. I'm an unaffiliated voter myself. Again, that's still that war in Ukraine, and the fact that it wasn't even brought up last night, it kind of worries me, because it makes it seem like it's not that big of an issue anymore. I mean, Vladimir Zelensky just came and did a tour of the country, or not the whole country, but it did a few pit stops here and got another $6 billion in aid that Joe Biden gave him. So, I mean, it's recent news, and it's a big story within the past 10 days. It wasn't even addressed last night, and that kind of makes me worried for the future of this. If this war doesn't end soon, Ukraine might be on their own, and Russia will just do meat wave after meat wave till they lost 4 million men and not care about it if they get what they want in the end. That's just how Russia does business. Just hundreds of years of doing that. Anyway, how do you guys feel about the debate last night? Again, I wish I could tell you that Tim Walz dunked all over JD Vance, but he didn't. It was much more of a back and forth, and you could honestly flip a coin as to who you really thought won the debate last night. Anyways, what say you guys? That is all.